AA Beyond Belief is a podcast for, by, and about people who have found a secular path to sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. A few days before Christmas, I spoke at the Paseo Group's Alkathon in Kansas City, Missouri. I wasn't terribly prepared for my talk, but I arrived about half an hour early, which gave me some time to jot a few ideas down on a napkin. Using the napkin as my guide, I talked about the language of recovery, the action I took and continue to take in my recovery, my thoughts about the steps and AA literature, and I also outlined my experience of getting and staying sober with the following words: defeat, hope, decision, getting honest, getting well, making amends, maintenance, seeking peace, and helping others. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm John. I'm an alcoholic, and it's great to be here. I spoke at a Paseo Alkathon. I think it was back in the 90s, and you were meeting in a little house off of the Paseo. I think it was on Florida or something. Anybody who's going to the group at that time?
That would have been Brooklyn.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
In the 90s?
Yeah.
That was a recovery clue.
I didn't either, but I staggered in there for time.
And then I don't think I spoke at another one until we got our We Agnostics group started. So now I think this is the 5th year in a row that I've spoken here. Yeah. And I love it, and I have a lot of respect for this group. One of the times I came here to speak, I was reading the archives that in the old across the street, and I was reading about the history of this group, and I remember reading about how this group started in 1947. It was called Kansas City Interracial, and it was the first time that black people and white people ever met together in Alcoholics Anonymous in Kansas City, and so I consider this to be the first truly inclusive AA group in Kansas City. And I think back to what that must have been like and what that meeting was like. And I'd almost like to transport myself back in time so I could talk to those people and understand what it felt like to be at that meeting. But then there was another story, and I was reminded of it because when you guys were saying the Lord's Prayer, I had to run away and hide somewhere, and I went in that room where your archives are now. And there's another story about what's his name? The fellow who wanted the big book. Frank. He wanted the big book, and there wasn't one around. And I found that really interesting too, because I have heard that back in the old days that the big book really wasn't so easy to come by.
Right.
And anyway, this guy got the book, but it reminded me of, I thought about him a few weeks ago. I went to the archives at Group 1, the Western Missouri archives, and I found in there a letter that somebody from Missouri wrote to GSO, and this was back in the 40s. I think it must have been before Group 1, because he wanted to know if there was an AA meeting in Missouri. And GSO wrote back and said, no, there aren't any, but they shipped him a big book, and they said, pay us if you can. If you can't, that's okay. And the big book was actually kind of pricey back then in those monies, but I thought that was really interesting. Back at that time, that book was pretty important, and finding other alcoholics that wanted to recover wasn't always so easy. So where we're at today, there's a lot to be grateful for. It's those people that came before us that made this possible. The Paseo group, for sure, one of the strongest groups in Kansas City when it comes to service. I never had anything to do with service in Alcoholics Anonymous until we started our group, We Agnostics. And when I went to the district, I went to the area, I'd see all these people from the Paseo group, and I said, that's what I want my group, We Agnostics, to be like. We're not quite there yet, but I'm inspired by some of the younger members of our group I'm kind of getting tired of having the business meetings and all that kind of stuff. But as I get tired and kind of hang back, I'm watching the younger people step up. And one of them came to me and she said, John, I think we'd like to have a business meeting in January and maybe even talk about having a GSR. I said, wow, well, I mean, last time we asked if anybody wanted to be a GSR, nobody was interested. Last time we asked if anybody wanted a treasurer, nobody was interested. So it looks like the group is beginning to grow up and is ready to take responsibility for itself. And so I'm really happy to see that occur.
Very good.
So anyway, I always wish that I would have prepared something before I come here, but it always turns out well anyway. I did write down some words on a piece of napkin and some things I wanted to talk about. Experience, language, action, how the steps are descriptive, not prescriptive. And I'm going to start, though, by the formula that they give us in AA, which is basically what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. So I've been sober for 31 years. Yeah, I've been sober and a member of Alcoholics Anonymous much longer than I was drinking. When I got here, my last drink, I was 25 years old, and what was going on in my life is I'd gotten arrested for drunk driving for the third time, and I lost my job, and I was defeated. I had been thinking that I needed help since I was about 19. So from the ages of 19 to 25, I was drinking alcoholically, and but I really couldn't admit it. I think my problem was I just figured that I was too young. But after that third DWI and being confronted by my employer about my drinking and the many times that they tried to convince me to get help and so forth, that was it for me. And so I made it to my first AA meeting. It was just a couple of weeks before my 26th birthday, and I went to the downtown Nooners group. And I remember walking into the room, and the first thing I saw on the wall were the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. And that first step, when I read it, it probably isn't how I would have put it in my language, but it really was a ideal description of how I felt. It was a poetic description, I guess. I was powerless over alcohol. My life had become unmanageable. There was no doubt when I read those words that rang true. And then the third tradition, that the only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking, gave me hope that was where I needed to be, because I got myself to the point where it was so bad for me. I even stopped debating whether or not I was an alcoholic. All I knew was I wanted to fucking stop drinking, excuse the language. And that was everything to me, to see that there. The worst thing that could have happened is if somebody would have said, oh, you're too young, you don't really qualify, that would have been awful. So I was welcomed into the fellowship, and I went to the downtown Nooners group for quite a while, and then I went to P3 where I went to meetings for 25 years, and I was always actively involved with AA by, going on 12-step calls and taking meetings to places and sponsoring people and all of that. And I worked the steps through the big book with a sponsor, reading it, underlining it, highlighting it, all of that, knowing it real well, and then working the steps with a sponsor too. I also learned how to. I also learned the language in AA. You kind of pick that up too, and that served me really well, because there was a point where I was. Well, put it this way: I realized that I really didn't believe in God, and so I could still talk the AA talk, and everybody was happy with that. But it got to a point where I couldn't do it anymore, and so I started speaking in my own way. And I was very comfortable with this idea that the steps are words. They weren't my words, but they were written by people who were describing an experience that they had. And I had the same experience, but I would describe it differently. And I see these steps and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous as a very practical thing. I focus more on what I do and less on what I believe. And what I do is the same thing as anybody who might believe that there's a power that's greater than them that helps them do it. So I kind of wrote down, I've written the steps in my own language lots of times, but this time I just put down a few words on a napkin. Sometimes they add up to 12, sometimes they don't. But this time I put down this is what I wrote down: defeat, hope, decision, get honest, get well, make amends, maintain, seek peace, and help others. So that's basically what I like to do. So I guess going into it is, I was talking to somebody just last week about the mystery of what it is that gets us to a point to admit that we're powerless over alcohol, and other people never get there. And it seems like it doesn't matter, how bad things get. Some people just never get to that point. And I don't know if they'll ever figure that out. And maybe there really isn't an answer for it. But all me and my friend knew who were talking about it was that we both had this experience where we were just convinced that if we were going to live, we had to stop drinking. And furthermore, we were convinced that we couldn't stop drinking. So that's a bad situation to be in. And what are you going to do but reach out for help? And I knew to go to Alcoholics Anonymous because that's what I read about in the papers. As a kid, I would read Dear Abby. Back then, you had newspapers you'd read, and I'd read the Dear Abby. And anytime someone had a drinking problem, she'd always say, "Go to Alcoholics Anonymous." So I always knew that was a thing to do. Plus, it's in the movies and everything. That was where you would go. And I don't truly know if there was anything else anyway. But so I knew to go there, and so I went, and immediately upon getting to that meeting and seeing the other people who described their drinking and it being like mine, and just looking at them and seeing that they weren't going through that life today, I immediately just had this sense of hope that if they could do it, I could do it. And I made a decision right then and there that I needed to go to these meetings, and I needed to figure out what they were doing, and I needed to stay sober. So that was basically the 3 steps right there, making that decision to stay sober. And so I was going to that group, the Downtown Nooners group, and it was a mixed group, men and women, and they were very good to me. Most of them were older than me. I was very young at the time. And somebody there recommended that I go to P3, and it was an all-men's group. And I thought that was kind of weird to go to an all-men's group, but it turned out to be a really good thing for me, because at that particular time, there were a lot of guys my age. A lot of us in our 20s were going to that group, and we were all getting sober together. And so I had this connection with these other people that were like me. And we didn't see each other just during the meetings, but we went out together to movies, all kinds of different things that we would do together. They were just friends, and that was really important to me, I think, in my sobriety, because my drinking was characterized by really not having friends, or rather just being isolated from other people. Though I was a bar drinker, I was alone when I was drinking. So that part of Alcoholics Anonymous was really critical, I think, for my recovery, was just that having friends and learning how to have fun and do things without getting messed up. So that was a huge deal. So I went to that group, like I say, for 25 years, and I kind of break up my sobriety like in decades when I look back at it, because you go through different periods of time. And I think that first 10 years of my sobriety, AA was pretty much my life. In other words, the friends I ran with were in AA. Pretty much everybody I was in contact with was in AA. I was going to many AA meetings. It was really what my life was at the time. And then after that 10-year period, my father died unexpectedly, and my mother had already died many years earlier. And it was a situation that whatever happened when he died, I took a stock of where I was in my life, and I wasn't satisfied that just as a person I didn't achieve any of the things that I wanted to achieve. So I was like 35 years old, and I hadn't gotten married or done all these other things that I thought that people should do. So I started doing things with my life that I couldn't do when I was drinking. So I went to school, and I ended up graduating and getting a degree. And then I went to another school, and I ended up graduating and getting another degree. And I was able to get a better job, buy a house, have relationships, eventually get married. So during this period of time when I was doing that, I was living more of my life outside of AA than I was the first 10 years. But AA was still what grounded me. And though I wasn't going to as many meetings, I was still going to meetings. And that was what was grounding me. And then after I got married, I resumed to my normal meeting schedule again. And then this is when my whole thing shifted with my my perception of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program and everything and the language. Really started changing during that second 10 years. I stopped praying. I was really, without even thinking about it, kind of giving up on this idea about God. I was never a religious person, and even in my early days in AA, I just thought I was just rationalizing it all. But it got to the point where I just couldn't even rationalize it anymore. So there was like the steady degradation of me not really believing what I was saying anymore. So I would sit in these meetings, and they would read something from the daily reflections or whatever, and it was always a very God-centered reading, and I could always find a way of saying what needed to be said that would make everybody's heads bob up and down with yeah. And so anyway, finally I decided, after reading some books, I'm an atheist, and it scared the hell out of me, because I thought I wasn't going to be able to do AA. But funny thing is that there's been atheists in AA since the very beginning. In fact, talking about language, the steps, when they were written, there was an atheist by the name of Jim Burwell who suggested a power greater than yourself and higher power to substitute for God in some of the steps, because he felt like we need to temper it down just a little bit. When the steps were first written, they were much more directive than they are now. They're now written in a more of a descriptive way. So in other words, the steps aren't telling us what we should do, but they're explaining what they experienced and what they did. And that's the way that I was taught to carry this message, is just let you know what I've experienced and what I do. I'm not here to tell anybody what they need to do. So anyway, so there's always been the atheists around. In fact, they've always had these groups, these agnostic groups, since 1975, and I never knew about it. I never knew they had these things. But I found out about it on the internet. Now that we can go online and Google things, you can find out anything. And so I found out they had these groups, and so I thought I would start one in Kansas City. And so I, in 2014, went up to my friend Jim, who was also an atheist at P3, and I said, "Would you like to start an AA group for agnostics and atheists?" And he says, "Yeah, let's do it." So we did, and the group really took off pretty quickly. I was surprised. I didn't tell anybody at P3 that we were leaving, that I was leaving on and doing it. I just disappeared, and we went off and started this other group. And I didn't really want. In fact, I didn't really want anyone from P3 to follow me over there. I was ready for a clean break. And what happened was we were finding people coming to our meeting that would not go to AA otherwise. Because now, like when I first went to AA, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know they had 12 steps. I didn't know that God was mentioned anywhere. I didn't know any of that stuff. But now, before you even go to an AA meeting, you Google it and you research it and you see all this stuff. And there's all kinds of, really wrong information and negative stuff out there too. So there are people that are just turned off and won't go because they might think it's a religious thing. So anyway, those people would come to our group. Those people would come, and also people who might have had a bad experience in AA previously. So it was kind of an interesting mix. And now what I'm seeing is the group has kind of evolved a lot. I'm seeing, from my perspective, younger people, 30s, 40s is kind of young for me, some in their 20s. And these are people who have never been to an AA meeting other than ours. So, and our meeting is a little bit different in that there's no opening or closing prayer, and we don't read how it works and things like that. And so there's not, and most of us are atheists or agnostics, so there's not the talk about God or anything. And this is the only AA that these people know. Now some of them, though, did come to the Paseo group. A group of them came out here, and they had a great time, by the way. They loved it. They loved it. So, but anyway, something I've learned about these people, these people, is I misjudged them originally. I thought that they were going to be, not receptive to old ideas, religious language, things like that. But what I'm finding out is that they're not as standoffish or off-put by that as you might think. They don't really view themselves in any particular belief system or whatever. They just, for whatever reason, they just don't see that it's pertinent to how they want to describe their recovery. So most of our meetings are a topic meeting where the chair of the meeting will do a lead for like 15 minutes or whatever, and then a meeting it goes on around that. Sometimes we'll use literature, outside literature, but not very often. For whatever reason, they prefer the topic meetings. We did start a step meeting this last year, which started off really popular, and we started it off because actually the younger people were asking for it. But it's kind of funny, they were asking for it, but they're not coming to those meetings. So I don't know. But I'm going. And so what we do is we don't read AA literature, but we read the steps from a secular perspective. And speaking of the AA literature, and I don't want to be controversial, but I did bring out the big book to that meeting because I wanted to somehow, when we started that step meeting, I wanted to incorporate the history of Alcoholics Anonymous with so that people could have some sort of an idea about how all this started. And but unfortunately, that didn't go over real well. A lot of people just did really have a hard time relating to the book. So I just had to stop messing with that. So I don't know how, I know that the big book is revered, and it should be because it was an important piece of literature. But I just wish sometimes that we could say, hey, thank you, Bill and Bob and everybody back then for putting all this down, but we can write too. And we have our own words and our own way of writing. And it would seem to me that if AA in the year 2020 would put out something that is more up to date, that it would make the headlines, and maybe we might see our membership spike. I don't know, but it's really hard. I remember even back in 1988. I'm not trying to trash the book or anything, but even in 1988, when I went to the library trying to read up on alcoholism, and I saw the big book, the AA book, and I thought, wow, this is really old. And that was back then. But anyway, but it still got value. In fact, I was thinking about something from the big book, and I was thinking about what I was going to say today. And there's one little paragraph in there that my sponsor did beat into my head that I do have committed to memory, and it did do me some good. And that paragraph is selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our trouble, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-seeking, self-delusion, self-pity. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate, seemingly without provocation. But invariably we found that at some time in the past, we made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. I've got it memorized, had it for a long time. I had a tough time with that in the beginning. My sponsor kept telling me about this self-centeredness and how I was self-centered, and I really took it in a judgmental way. But when the thing about the steps is that what we learn about ourselves, it's a fact-finding mission. It's not a judgmental. It's not a I'm a bad person mission. I need to figure out how bad I am. It's a fact-finding mission. So I learned how to look at my behaviors without I guess, attaching some sort of bad feeling about myself because I engage in these behaviors. So in other words, I can do selfish things, and I did selfish things, and I still do. Doesn't necessarily make me, on the whole, as a selfish person or a bad person. But I think addiction, the very nature of it, and alcoholism, when we're sick and in our disease, just the very nature of it forces a person in that situation to be self-centered, because you got to do anything you can do to get that next drink. And I know I certainly did. I did some really bad things, without thinking about who I was hurting, who I was conning, and that's definitely selfish behavior there. But it was behavior that was driven from a physical need for another drink. But that behavior from my addiction spilled over into other areas of my life. I had to cover up for my drinking. I had to hide it from people. So my whole world evolved around me and thinking about me and my problems and how I was going to hide my problems or get out of a situation. That was my life. So it makes sense to me that behavior would follow me after I stopped drinking. So it really took a lot of effort to unlearn that behavior. And the only way that I could was to figure out why I react to life the way I do anyway. And that's what the inventory steps did for me. Again, when I first started doing it, like most of us, I really had a hard time with it. I'd write, I'd get depressed, I'd put it away. But once I actually started doing it, what you find is you're looking at the facts of what happened in your life and how you reacted to it and why you reacted that way. And it's not a big deal. But what I did as I went through that, I definitely saw a pattern going on with me. And the pattern that I saw with me was a very insecure person all my life. I grew up in a household where I didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. And I was growing up in this army family. We moved around all over the place, and you never knew where you were going to go. There was violence and yelling and screaming. There was just a lot of chaos around me, and not to put the blame on that, but that insecurity just kind of drove me throughout my life, I guess, just trying to find some sense of peace, I guess. And maybe I was looking for it in a bottle, I don't know. I do know that the feeling that the alcohol gave me was a feeling of relief initially. So, but what it was actually doing was kind of numbing me down. But yeah, that's what it was. It was a fact-finding mission of what it was that drove me. And after I did that, and you look at the whole big picture as I looked at the whole big picture of my life, and I looked at all these people that I resented and so forth, along with that came some understanding, not only of myself, but of the other people, primarily my parents, and people that I may have hurt even. And I knew right then and there what I needed to do, what kind of amends I needed to make and that kind of thing. And so it almost was a natural process from there. Those inventory steps were really big for me to push me on. It really was just a natural thing. But after doing that, it's just a matter of maintaining it. It's just like I write down here. It's like you make your amends, you maintain, and you seek peace. That seek peace to me is step 11. As an atheist, you think, how the heck are you going to do step 11? It's a lot of God stuff written in there. But when I look at the steps, I'm looking at what I'm actually seeking and doing. What am I wanting out of it? And when I read step 11, what I see that I'm really seeking is peace of mind or serenity. For me, the serenity prayer is a perfect replacement for step 11. In fact, that's what I used for a long time, was that. Now I'm becoming a little bit more interested in meditation. I'm not real good at it, but I'm understanding now that there's a lot of value in it. And so meditation is a form of prayer too, but it's something that they're finding some real value to, scientifically, that there is actual some value in meditating and training your brain. I know the periods of time that I did meditate on a regular basis, the benefit that I got from it was this whole learning to let go of things. Because in meditation, you become aware of your thoughts. Because I think that when I was initially trying to meditate, I thought that my goal was not to have thoughts. But all I could do is know that the thoughts were happening, but I learned how not to latch on to them. So I could just watch my thoughts float by. And doing that while I meditate helped remind me to do that during my regular workday. That if I had a feeling or a thought, I didn't have to hang on to it, but I could watch it drift away like a leaf on a stream or a cloud in the sky, just not hang on to it. But it takes real practice and effort to do that on a regular basis. I look at meditation just like working out, and I'm just as bad at working out as I am with meditation. But when I do go to the gym and work out and run and all that, I feel great and I love it, and it just makes you want to do it again and again and again. And that's the same thing with meditation. I had that experience with meditation. But when you stop doing it, you forget about what benefits you were getting from it. So for me, it's a constant battle. But I'm beginning to see again that the meditation is probably something I do want to incorporate. I was initially going to say, no, it's not for me, just not even look at it. But I think the more I listen to other people talk about it, the more value that I see in it. And then, of course, helping others. That's the core, I think, of what we do here. I mean, we probably start doing it from the day we walk in. I mean, I know that when I walked in that first meeting, I was probably helping the people that were already there because I reminded them of who they were at one time. But there's a tremendous amount of, I don't know. I'll tell you this. The best thing that I ever did in my life was help start an AA group. Because I get to have this experience of watching people benefit from something that I, in some small way, helped get going. And I'm watching these people get sober and get their lives together and make friends. And more than that, now, like I said, I'm watching them love and care for the group. And it's just a beautiful experience. It's the best experience I've ever had. And that's service, and that is helping them. But it's also something I was doing for me. That's another funny thing. I was talking about someone today. You know how they always say this is a selfish program. I hear people nowadays saying that they hate that saying that it's a selfish program because it's not a selfish program because we're always giving and all this kind of stuff. But what they're really trying to say, as I understood it when people told me that it's a selfish program, is that, yeah, it's an altruistic program. We're doing things for other people. We're not really expecting anything in return, but ultimately we're doing it for to save our own butts. We're doing this because this is how we stay sober. I heard somebody in here before I started speaking, he was talking about amends, and he says, that person doesn't have to forgive you. That you're doing that to clean your side of the street, and that's the truth. I mean, that's what these steps are. We are really doing everything that we do in AA. We're doing for ourselves. Before I even got to my first AA meeting, the woman who was confronting me with my drinking, she told me, get help, but do it for yourself. Stop drinking and do it for yourself. And I don't know why she said that, but I guess she was telling me, don't do it for your father, don't do it to try to get your job back, don't do it for this or that, but just do it for yourself.
Right.
And ultimately, that's really what I was doing. I was doing it because I couldn't live otherwise. But yeah, there's all kinds of different ways to be of service. John here is the DCM for our district, which is a way to serve. I go to Area 39, and I'm the chair of the Archives Committee. I don't do a very good job. I don't think I've done anything since I've been the chair of the Archives Committee, but I go and I sit in the meetings and I do what I do. But the thing that I get out of that, though, is just being around other alcoholics that aren't in my group. For me, it's important to feel connected to the rest of AA as a whole, especially when I go to this agnostic group. And I don't really go to other meetings. To be honest with you, I have a really hard time with AA meetings in general. And I'm just very uncomfortable sometimes. But I'm not at my group. But when I go to the area assembly in Sedalia, I'm not uncomfortable at all, because there, no one's talking about they're just talking about how to do something, how to get something done. They're talking about practical action and doing things. They're not talking about. No one's telling me to pray or anything like that. It's just it's a lot nicer for me. So for me, that's really important to stay involved with that. I think that I don't care to ever have another service position ever again, believe me, when it comes to district or area. But I will always go to the area assembly, I think, as long as I can, just so I can be around these people from these other parts of the state. I get a lot out of it. It's a lot of fun for me to meet somebody who's very different from me, but then also to find out what we have in common. And I honestly believe that what we have in common is far, far more than any difference that we have. And that's true if I go to area assembly or any place else. So I hope I haven't pissed anybody off by anything I said.
No.
That's okay. But I will tell you this. AA is my home. AA is what raised me. Like I say, I've been here most of my life now. The principles that I've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous are how I live my life. Anytime I have a problem, this is what I lean on. When I'm not comfortable, I'm comfortable in AA. I'm comfortable here. When you guys do your thing, I can go to the other room. But anyway, thank you. Glad to be here.
I never brought a man. Should all acquaintance be forgot for all and sign? For all and sign, my dear, for all and sign. We take a
and pick the daisies fine, but we wandered many a weary foot since Auld Lang Syne. For Auld Lang Syne, my dear, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne. Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot for Auld Lang Syne? For Auld Lang Syne, my dear, for Auld Lang Syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne.